After the federal election in October, the Broadbent Institute commissioned Abacus Data to conduct a landmark survey to measure Canadians' attitudes about voting system design and preference for electoral reform. This research, conducted by Abacus, is the first study of its kind in size, and it helped to kickstart a national conversation about electoral reform. It's a hot topic right now because the Liberal government has promised that 2015 will be the last federal election held under our current system of first past the post. So what do Canadians actually want to see in a new electoral system? We are so pleased to be joined today by David Coletto. He is one of the founding partners and CEO of Abacus Data, a public opinion and marketing research consultancy. David manages the day-to-day operations of Abacus and leads its team of research and consultants and strategists. And he is here with us today to provide a deeper dive into the research results released in December. Specifically, he's going to be talking to us about the values and principles held by Canadians for consideration in designing a new electoral system. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me. Well, I appreciate everyone's interest. I'm going to switch over to the presentation, and then we'll get into some of the results. But while we do that, I wanted to give some insight into the survey itself. So we did this survey on behalf of the Broadbent Institute, and we surveyed almost 3,000 Canadians across the country in early November. And so I'll show you some of the results, if we can. Share the.
We're setting up the PowerPoint presentation right now, and we will be taken off screen, so you won't be watching us the entire time, but you'll be able to look at the survey results.
I'm not a presenter right now, so.
Okay. In the meantime, I just want to. I just wanted to let people know that they can submit their questions through the question chat box. If you have any comments that you'd like to share, please send them to info@broadbentinstitute.ca. And please use the question chat box only to ask questions. We really know that there are hundreds of people on the call, and we want to make sure we get to as many of your questions as possible.
Well, I think we've got it working, so sorry for the technical difficulty there. So this is a really exciting project for a number of reasons. One is that the Liberal government, the Liberal Party promised that they would change the system, that 2015 would be the last election in which we'd have first past the post. So we were tasked with trying to understand public opinion around this issue. And so what I'm going to talk about over the next half an hour is a number of questions, try to answer a number of questions that this research looked at. For example, how do Canadians feel about the current electoral system? Do they think it should be changed a lot, a little bit, or not at all? Do they think the Liberal government should follow through on its promise of reform? Something that's being debated now in the media and among the public. We asked Canadians what they think. And perhaps most important to this study was trying to understand, in a way that I don't think had been done before in Canada or in other countries, what do Canadians actually value in an electoral system as a guide for us, as for policymakers who are going to be designing the next system, for those of you who are interested in advocating one system over the other, what are the things that Canadians are looking for? Then we'll go into looking at preferences around specific systems that have been proposed, and answer a question that's come up recently, in that, is there an actual problem that needs to be fixed? And we tried to understand that question a little bit in our survey as well. So let me start with the question about, how do Canadians feel about the current way we elect our MPs? And what we learned was that, for the most part, very few people think everything is great and nothing needs to be changed. Just under 1 out of 5 Canadians believe that everything's working well and nothing needs to be changed. So the vast majority of Canadians, when we asked them right at the beginning of the survey, believe that at least some change needs to occur to our electoral system. What we find is that about 40% of Canadians believe that the system needs either major changes or needs to be changed completely. And throughout the survey, I'll talk a lot about those that want change and those that don't, or don't see the need for significant change. I'll also talk a lot about what we see in research, and Abacus released another survey yesterday that mirrors this, that there's a large portion of the country that isn't really engaged in this question and don't have clear views. And I think that group, as we're going to see throughout, is going to be important to this debate. If this becomes a larger public debate, if the Liberals move ahead and all sides try to enter it, there's a significant group that really either doesn't care about this issue or doesn't know enough about electoral reform and voting systems to have clear opinions, and that's going to be important. And they are really representative of that group here, that 41% who say that the system needs only minor changes. They for many reasons don't know whether it does or not, and that's going to be important. When we look at the specific groups, though, that are more likely to believe that major change or complete change is needed, what we see across the country is that those who live in Quebec, those who voted NDP, Green, or Bloc in the last election, and those, not surprisingly, who are most concerned about electoral reform are more likely to think that major change is needed. But it doesn't mean that all Liberal voters and all Conservative voters are satisfied with the status quo. In fact, 1 out of 4 Liberal and Conservative voters think the system needs major changes. So yes, those that perhaps aren't as representative as they should be in the House of Commons, for example, those who support the Green Party or the Bloc or the NDP, feel that the system needs to change, or for ideological reasons support a more proportional system, but so do a significant portion of Liberal and Conservative supporters. And so I don't think we can ignore that fact. When we asked the question specifically, knowing what the Liberals had promised during the campaign and had reiterated following their swearing in and the mandate letters were sent to the minister, do Canadians think the Liberal government should follow through on its promise of reform? And what we find is that yes, by a 2-to-1 margin, Canadians are far more likely to think the Liberals should follow through on this promise. And when we look at the specific results, you can see 44% believe the Liberals should change the system, follow through on their promise. Only about a quarter think that no, they shouldn't. We should keep the existing system. But then we see this large 32% of Canadians who say they have no clear views on this issue. And again, we asked a very similar question recently. This survey was done in November. At the beginning of January, we asked a similar question, and the results are pretty much exactly the same. A large portion think the system should be changed, the Liberals should follow through, but there's also a large system of those who are somewhat less engaged. If we look again below the top line and understand who wants the Liberals to follow through, well, first let's focus on those who voted Liberal. Those are the voters that the Liberal government is going to be most interested in knowing their views. Well, by again at almost more than a 2-to-1 margin, 48% to 23 Liberal voters think that the party they supported should follow through, as do a majority of New Democrat voters, much larger proportion of Green Party voters, and even, although lesser extent, a third of those who voted Conservative think the Liberals should keep their promise and move ahead on this. And I think what's at play here are two factors. One is those who support electoral reform. They are obviously more want the Liberals to move forward. But there's also a political question that Canadians generally want politicians and governments to keep their promises. And so I think this is going to be a pressure point for the government, because even if there's some people who may not care or have a clear preference on an electoral system, they are going to want to make sure, and as the Liberal government's going to want to make sure that that they follow through on the promise. When we look at other key groups here, interestingly, those with higher levels of education are more likely to want the Liberals to keep their promises, university educated, college educated. So those that are, generally speaking, more involved in politics, more engaged on public affairs issues, they are more likely to be engaged and supportive of change when it comes to electoral reform. Moving forward then, and I think this is the centerpiece of the research and perhaps the most interesting. We asked Canadians in an exercise to identify the 5 values. We gave them a list of almost 20 different objectives or values that a electoral system can have, and we asked them to pick the 5 they thought were the most important. And so first, I'm going to share the results among all respondents, and then I'll show you the differences across those who actually wanted change. Among all Canadians, the top 5 issues were: first, 55% selected the ballot is simple and easy to understand. 2, the system produces stable and strong governments. The majority of people picked that. Number 3 was the system allows you to directly elect MPs who represent your community. 4, the system ensures that the government has MPs from each region of the country. And that 5, the system ensures that the number of seats held by a party in Parliament closely matches their actual level of support throughout the country. So if we had to sum up, right, what do most Canadians want to see in an electoral system? Well, not surprisingly, they want a fairly easy to use system. They want one where, I think this is the value that our Westminster system is built in. They want a local representative who represents their local district. They want MPs from all over the country represented in the government, all things that I think most people would agree with. But where we see differences from our current system is on number 5, that we have a significant portion of Canadians in general who say they want to see a system that produces a parliament that reflects the preferences and views of those across the country in their political views. Number 2 is an interesting one. We'll talk about that quite a bit today, the notion that they want a system that produces stable and strong governments. And I'll note in a moment that this is not necessarily the same thing as Canadians want majority governments all the time. But I think it's important to think about, if you're a proponent of proportional representation, for example, many of the systems across the country that have proportional representation, you would describe, for example, Germany or New Zealand as having stable and strong governments. So it's a notion that very few Canadians, I would suspect, would want weak and unstable government, right? This is the notion that I think we all agree on. So how then can you communicate that the system that you propose or that you advocate for will help produce these stable and strong governments? When we look specifically at those who want reform, or as I call them, the pro-reformers, we do see a slightly different ordering of the preferences. And most importantly is that the notion of proportionality, or that support is reflected clearly or more closely in Parliament, comes to the top of the list. So half of those who want change want a system that better reflects the views of the country. Simplicity is still near the top, as is strong and stable governments, which I think is a reflection of the fact that it doesn't necessarily mean majority governments. Interesting as well, those who want reform also selected in large numbers another way of describing proportionality, that the system ensures seats in Parliament reflect the proportion of the vote a party receives nationally. So an even more clear proportionality value, it was expressed by these voters. And then lastly, the system makes it easy to get rid of governments that are out of sync with the population, partly a reflection to the fact that a lot of pro-reformers do not support the Conservatives, and for the last 4 years, those voters had a government that a majority of the country did not support, being able to basically govern with a blank check and being able to do whatever it wants. So that, I think, is part of the reaction we're seeing. So some of we asked a whole number of goals, and not all of them obviously made the top 5. Some things that were picked less often by Canadians. So opportunities for independent candidates to be elected. Only 20% put that in their top 5. Encourage parties to reach beyond loyal supporters. Something that might be surprising to many of you, a system that makes it easier for women and people from diverse backgrounds to get elected. One way to interpret this number is not that people don't think that that's important, but that they may not easily connect an electoral system being able to produce those kinds of outcomes. And I think that's part of the work that Equal Voice and other organizations are doing across the country to raise awareness about the importance of a more diverse House of Commons or legislatures across the country. Interestingly, we gave a variation of the principle behind a ranked or preferential ballot. Only 23% put this in their top 5. Those elected have majority support in a district. So the majoritarian principle behind that system was only selected by less than a quarter of people. And then lastly, what was near the bottom of the list was this notion of the system produces majority governments. So again, this is a reflection of the fact that people want strong and stable governments, but it doesn't necessarily mean they understand that they get those through majorities, or that a majority government is even what they prefer the most. So moving on. So those are the values: simplicity, proportionality, local representatives are what Canadians are looking for, or more Canadians are looking for. So when we ask Canadians then, what kind of system do you want? And there's no easy way to do this, and those that advocate for STV, or single transferable vote, have told me, and I've received many notions, that we didn't include this in the option. But we wanted to keep it as simple as we could. And so we offered 4 systems, including the one that we currently have. And we asked people, which do you prefer the most, if you had to choose? And so among those that wanted change, we'll start with those Canadians. Mixed member proportional and list-based proportional representation were the top 2. 38% picked MMP, or mixed member proportional, 23% picked a list-based system. Ranked ballot was the first choice of 20%, and single member plurality, you can see at the bottom, was the choice of 19%. So you may be wondering, among those who want to change in the system, how is it that 19% still picked our current system? Well, that may be a reflection that they didn't like any of the other choices, or they think that the current system is the best, but maybe some tweaks to it could be made. So when we roll up those that want to prefer a proportional system versus the other 2, you can see among those who want change, 61% say they prefer either MMP, mixed member proportional, or a list proportional system. Okay, so those are among people who want change. Not surprisingly that there's a clear preference for a different system than the one that we have now. But what about all Canadians? Well, here we found that in fact, when we just split the 4 types of systems independently, that the current system actually is the most preferred, or at least a plurality of Canadians picked the status quo, the single member plurality system. 27% picked mixed member. And again, we gave a slight description of each of these in our survey, and you can see the wording of that in the report we did for Broadbent on the Broadbent Institute website. When we roll these 2 up, though, we do see a very split decision, with 44% preferring either the proportional mixed member system or the list proportional system, compared to 43% for the status quo. And I will note that only 14% of Canadians in general picked ranked ballot or preferential ballot as their preferred option. So just to wrap up, a few more things. First is the question of, is there a problem that electoral reform can pick? Part of the narrative that we've seen, particularly in the media, in the news media, has been, what's the problem? We don't need electoral reform. And apart from those that will argue that our current system produces false majorities, a term that's been used by political scientists across the country, meaning less than a majority vote for a party that often gets majority of the seats and therefore pretty much full control in our legislatures. Apart from the fact that we do see an underrepresentation of women and diverse backgrounds in Parliament, which is partly attributed to the actual system itself, we find that in this survey that a significant number of people admit to not voting for the party that was their first choice in order to prevent another party from winning. Basically, a definition of strategic voting. And almost half of Canadians admit or agree that they have done that at some point in the past. And when we look at who is more likely to say they voted strategically, it's not clear. It's not concentrated among one group. Among those who voted Liberal in the last federal election in October, half of them said that at some point they had voted for a party that wasn't their first choice. Similarly, a majority of New Democrat voters, almost a majority of Green Party voters, and even a third of those who voted Conservative have said at some point they haven't voted for the party that wasn't their first choice. And so I think about that Conservative supporter who lives in downtown Toronto or downtown Montreal. There is probably no chance that a MP from the Conservatives will get elected in those districts. Similarly, if you live in rural Alberta and you're a New Democrat supporter, odds are you're not going to likely have your vote count in the way that preference is going to somehow be reflected in Parliament. And so what I think Canadians recognize, and what I think Broadbent Institute and those that support change are saying here, is that part of the problem is that our system doesn't allow people to express their true preference, and they don't get the government they actually want. They only often get they vote for the government they want the least, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Of note, those most concerned about electoral reform are also the most likely to say they voted strategically in the past. So this fact that they can't vote their true preference is driving their interest in change and reform. The last thing we did in this study for Broadbent is we asked ourselves what would happen if the 2015 election was run under a different electoral system. And while this is not a perfect model because people's voting behavior may change under different rules, I think it's a demonstration of what happens under different systems. So this is the results of our current system, the actual election results. The Liberals won 40% of the popular vote, received 54% of the seats. The Conservatives' actual vote was quite close to its proportion of seats, but you can see the smaller parties were underrepresented in the House of Commons relative to the vote percentage that they got. If we were to show a parliament under a proportional system where the seats closely match the proportion of the vote that the parties got, you can see that obviously the Liberals would be reduced to a minority. They would have about 40% of the seats in the House. The Conservatives would have about the same number of MPs, but the NDP, the Bloc, and the Green Party caucus would be significantly larger under a proportional system. But the real question was, and the more difficult question to answer, is what would happen under a ranked or preferential ballot? And so what we did is we asked Canadians in the same survey to imagine the same ballot that they had, allowing them to rank the choices, their parties, from first choice to fourth. So we gave people the opportunity to rank the four choices. And we used that data with the large sample size that we had to understand what would happen if in a district or an electoral district, no candidate got 50% on the first sort of ballot. How would that result go? And we did that right across the country to try to simulate the results of a ranked or preferential ballot election. And our estimates indicate that if the 2015 election had been run using this system, the Liberals would have won an even larger majority, 64% of the seats. They would have almost shut out the Conservatives in British Columbia. They would have taken a number of seats away from the New Democrats in Ontario. And the Conservatives would have been the greatest, I guess, they would have been hurt the most by that system because second and third preferences among Liberal or NDP voters were rarely the Conservative Party. And so the system that's potentially being proposed by the government, or one that's being at least rumored to be proposed, would, at least based on 2015 results, definitely benefit the Liberals at the expense of most of the other parties, particularly the Conservatives. So some concluding thoughts then. I guess my first thought as a political scientist, not as the pollster here, is that designing an electoral system, I think that addresses the preferences of Canadians is certainly not an easy task. One of the defining features of the research that we did is that there's no consensus across the country. When you ask people to list or rank what they value the most in a system, we see that even simplicity was only picked by 55% of people. So there's no clear goals, and part of that is because we ask people to pick 5 as opposed to tell us how important each of these are. What's clear, though, is that more Canadians want a proportional electoral system that produces stable government, is easy to understand, elects local MPs, and ensures that the government has MPs from every region of the country. Those are the values that more people can get behind and want to see in their system. And as a reflection of our current system, many of those values aren't easily expressed through our current system. We've had an instance where certain regions of the country have been underrepresented in government. Sometimes, in the case of the Conservatives, after the last election, no MPs. After one of their only MPs in Newfoundland and Labrador was defeated in a by-election, they had no MPs from certain provinces. So they don't have equal representation across the board. Ranked or preferential ballots would not be, I think, a significant improvement to this. I think that's what we've seen in our estimate, as we've shown here. It would actually create an even less proportional legislature if 2015 election had been run under that. So if you're the Liberals and you're clearly debating what to do about this, I think our data and the data that we released this week shows that people expect them to follow through on the promise. And Mr. Trudeau and the minister have made it clear that they will follow through. So there is pressure on them to move in that direction. My last point would be, if you're on this webinar, you're probably very interested in electoral reform. I'm very interested in it. I know Alejandra's interested in it, but we're not normal. We are not typical across the country. And so what our data also finds is that there is a significant portion who will be very difficult to engage and mobilize and speak to in this, simply because they don't have very clear thoughts. And this can be somewhat of a complicated debate to have, right? The design of a system and how it works is not always easy. And so as we move towards, consultations and whatever the Liberal government ends up doing, I think the data gives us a blueprint to how a made in Canada system can be designed that best fulfills, I think, the goals and values that Canadians want to see in that system. And so I think that's one of the main lessons of and opportunities of the research here. So that is my presentation. I thank you for listening.